The year was 1945, and the world was holding its breath. In the rolling hills of Germany, the iron grip of the Third Reich was finally shattering. But across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a different kind of darkness was brewing. The Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer a fleet in the traditional sense. It had become a wounded predator, cornered and desperate, as the United States military moved closer to the Japanese home islands. The resistance did not weaken, it curdled into something fanatical, something that defied the logic of modern warfare. The target was Okinawa, a final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself. This was Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and standing in the way of the Allied juggernaut was a weapon that terrified even the most hardened American sailors, the kamikaze. To protect the massive carrier groups and the vulnerable transport ships huddling near the beaches of Okinawa, the U.S. Navy established a ring of fire known as the Radar Picket Line. There were 16 stations in total, scattered like lonely sentinels across the dark waters surrounding the island. Their mission was simple but suicidal: act as a human radar screen. They were to spot incoming Japanese air raids and direct American fighter interceptions before the enemy could reach the main fleet. Of all these stations, Picket Station Number 1 was the most dreaded. It sat at the northernmost point, directly in the flight path of planes launched from Kyushu, the Japanese mainland. It was the gatekeeper of the fleet, and on the morning of April 16, 1945, that gate was being guarded by the USS Laffey. The USS Laffey, a 2,200-ton L&M Sumner-class destroyer, was a marvel of American industrial might. She was fast, sleek, and bristling with more anti-aircraft guns than any ship her size had a right to carry. Her commander was Frederick Julian Beckton, a man who carried a heavy burden of history. Beckton had been the executive officer of the previous Laffey, a ship that had been sent to the bottom of the ocean during the brutal night battles of Guadalcanal. He had seen his ship sink once before, and he had vowed that he would not let it happen again. His crew was a mix of seasoned veterans and green recruits, boys from the Midwest and the East Coast who had been forged into a cohesive unit through months of grueling drills and sudden skirmishes. But nothing they had faced could prepare them for the 80 minutes of absolute hell that was about to descend upon them. The day began in a shroud of tension. At 4:30 in the morning, the radar operators in the ship's cramped, dimly lit combat information center picked up the first pings. Multiple boogies were circling to the north. The ship went to general quarters, the rhythmic clanging of the alarms sending men scrambling from their bunks to their battle stations. But for hours, the enemy hesitated. They hovered on the edge of the radar, testing the defenses, looking for a gap. It was a psychological game, a slow-burn torture designed to wear the American sailors down before the real onslaught began. Commander Beckton knew the Japanese were waiting for the sun to climb higher, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with the light at their backs. At 8:30 a.m., the mask finally slipped. The radar screens didn't just show contacts, they were saturated. A massive force of nearly 165 Japanese aircraft was heading south, while American combat air patrol fighters, the famous F-4U Corsairs, intercepted many of the attackers. Dozens of Japanese pilots had a different objective. They weren't looking for the carriers. They were looking for the small, isolated destroyer that was directing the defense. They wanted to blind the fleet by killing the Laffey. The first two attackers were Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers. They emerged from the clouds like birds of prey, pushing into steep, screaming dives aimed directly at the Laffey's bridge. The destroyer's 5-inch guns began to roar, their heavy shells blooming into black puffs of smoke in the sky. The proximity fuses worked perfectly, and the first Val was disintegrated in a mid-air fireball. The second Val, seeing the fate of its comrade, tried to pull out of its dive, but it was caught by the relentless fire of the 20mm Oerlikon gunners. It splashed into the sea just yards from the hull, sending a massive plume of salt water over the deck. The crew barely had time to cheer before the next wave arrived. This wasn't a coordinated military strike, it was a swarm. From every point of the compass, Japanese planes began to dive. A 4-engine Emily flying boat made a low-level run, but the Laffey's gunners shredded its wings, sending it tumbling into the ocean. Seconds later, a Judy dive bomber crashed into the ship's radar mast, its engine tearing through the delicate electronic arrays before spinning off into the water. The explosion showered the bridge with shrapnel and hot oil. The Laffey was now blind on her port side, her primary means of detecting the enemy crippled. By 9 a.m., the ship was a scene of controlled chaos. The heat from the constant firing of the 40mm Bofors and the 20mm Oerlikons was so intense that the paint on the gun barrels was beginning to blister and peel. Sailors worked in a feverish trance, passing heavy ammunition crates up from the magazines, their shirts soaked with sweat and stained with grease. In the aft 5-inch turret, Mount 53, a disaster was unfolding. A shell had jammed in the hoist, rendering the gun useless. As a Japanese plane bore down on them, the gun captain grabbed a heavy sledgehammer and began smashing the mechanism with primal fury. He didn't care about the technical manual, he cared about survival. With a loud metallic crack, the hoist cleared and the gun roared back to life, blowing the wings off an incoming Kate torpedo bomber just seconds before impact. Then came the blow that should have ended the story. A Judy dive bomber, hidden by the thick black smoke rising from the Laffey's own funnels, managed to drop a 500-pound bomb directly onto the aft deck. The explosion was catastrophic. It ripped through the thin steel plating, destroyed the steering gear room, and killed every man inside. The Laffey's rudder was jammed at a 26-degree turn to port. The ship was no longer a maneuverable combatant, it was trapped in a permanent, predictable circle. To the Japanese pilots circling overhead, the Laffey was now a sitting duck, a sacrificial lamb waiting for the final slaughter. With the ship stuck in its circle of death, the kamikazes intensified their attacks. They came in waves of 3 and 4, attacking from multiple angles to overwhelm the remaining guns. A Val crashed into the aft superstructure, its fuel tanks exploding and turning the back of the ship into a raging inferno. Another plane dived into the same spot seconds later, adding to the carnage. The damage control teams, led by men who refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat, ran directly into the flames. They fought the fires with foam and salt water while shrapnel whistled through the air round them. Many were killed where they stood, only to be replaced by sailors who had never been trained for firefighting, but were driven by a desperate need to save their home. In the middle of this carnage, a moment of incredible skill and bravery occurred in the sky above. Lieutenant Carl Riemann, flying a Corsair from the Grim Reaper's squadron, dived his fighter into the middle of the Japanese swarm. He had already shot down several planes and was completely out of ammunition, but he refused to leave the Laffey to her fate. He used his heavy Corsair as a physical weapon, flying so close to a Japanese plane that his propeller literally chopped off the enemy's tail. He pulled up so sharply that his landing gear clipped the Laffey's mast, but he succeeded in diverting the attacker. The sailors on the deck, covered in soot and blood, looked up and saw their guardian angel, and for a brief moment their resolve was hardened. But the Japanese were relentless. By 9:30 a.m., the Laffey had been hit by 6 kamikazes, and for direct bomb hits, 2 of her 3 main 5-inch turrets were silent, their crews dead or the guns warped by the heat. The deck was a twisted graveyard of blackened metal and smoldering wreckage. An officer, his face unrecognizable under a layer of oil and ash, approached Commander Beckton on the bridge. He pointed to the raging fires and the jammed rudder, and suggested that it might be time to abandon ship. Beckton looked out over his battered vessel, at the men who were still fighting, and at the American flag that was still fluttering, albeit scorched and tattered, from the mast. He gave the reply that would define the ship's legacy. No, I'll never abandon ship as long as a single gun will fire. The final 10 minutes were a test of pure endurance. The 20mm gunners, some of them teenagers who had never seen a dead body until an hour ago, were now veterans of a lifetime. They stood in their harnesses, their feet ankle-deep in spent brass casings, and continued to lead their targets through the smoke. They were firing at planes that were so close they could see the faces of the Japanese pilots. One kamikaze was disintegrated so close to the ship that the pilot's silk scarf landed on the deck. Another plane was hit so hard by a 5-inch shell that it vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving nothing but a fine mist of oil and debris to rain down on the sailors. At 9:47 a.m., as suddenly as it had begun, the sky went quiet. The remaining Japanese planes, seeing a massive reinforcement of American fighters arriving on the horizon, broke off their attacks and fled back toward the north. The 80 minutes of hell were over. The Laffey was still afloat, but she was barely recognizable as a ship. She was a black and twisted hulk, her stern sunken low in the water, her decks covered in foam, blood, and the wreckage of over 20 planes. The silence that followed was heavy and eerie, broken only by the crackle of fires and the soft moans of the wounded. The toll was staggering. 32 men were dead, their lives ended in flashes of gasoline and steel. 71 more were wounded, many with burns that would scar them for the rest of their lives. Out of a crew of 336, nearly a third were casualties. But as the smoke cleared, the men realized they had achieved the impossible. They had faced 20 separate attacks. They had been hit more times than any ship in history that managed to stay afloat. They had looked into the eyes of the divine wind and refused to blink. The journey back to the repair base was a slow, agonizing crawl. The Laffey was towed by a tugboat, her hull held together by patches and prayers. When she finally arrived at the repair docks, the sailors from other ships stood in silence as she passed. They had never seen anything like it. The inspectors who eventually boarded the ship were baffled by recalculation of buoyancy and structural integrity. The Laffey should have folded in half and plummeted to the bottom of the Pacific. One inspector famously remarked that the only thing keeping the ship afloat was the sheer stubbornness of the men who sailed her. The story of the USS Laffey didn't end at Okinawa. She was eventually repaired and returned to the United States, where she was greeted as a legend. But the ship that would not die wasn't finished with history. She was recommissioned for the Korean War, where she provided crucial fire support for United Nations troops. Her guns once again barking at an enemy on the horizon. She served through the tense years of the Cold War, patrolling the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, a living symbol of American resilience. She was not finally decommissioned until 1975, 30 years after she was supposed to have been destroyed. Today, the USS Laffey rests in the quiet waters of Charleston, South Carolina, as a museum ship at Patriots Point. She is the only Sumner-class destroyer remaining in the world. When you walk her decks today, it is easy to forget the violence she once endured. The sun reflects off her polished brass, and the only sound is the gentle lapping of the tide against her hull. But if you look closely at the steel of her superstructure, you can still find the scars. You can see the places where the metal was twisted and reformed. The Laffey is more than just a collection of steel, wire, and guns. She is a testament to the fact that a ship is only as strong as the souls of the people inside her. On that April morning in 1945, the Japanese tried to break the spirit of the United States Navy by destroying the Laffey. They failed. They found instead a crew that would not yield and a ship that would not die. Every man who stood his ground that day, from the cooks who carried ammunition to the gunners who stayed in their seats until the very end, contributed to a legacy of courage that continues to inspire. The USS Laffey stands as a reminder that even in our darkest, most desperate hours, when the world is crashing down around us and we are stuck in a circle of fire, the human spirit has the power to endure, to fight back, and to survive against all odds. The divine wind blew with everything it had that day, but it was met by a storm of American lead and a wall of human resolve. And in the end, it was the wind that broke, not the ship. The USS Laffey remains a silent sentinel of history, a guardian of the memory of those 32 men who gave everything to keep her afloat, and a permanent reminder that there is no force on earth, no bomb, no plane, and no fire that can sink a ship that simply refuses to go down. This is the story of the USS Laffey, the ship that survived the unsurvivable, the ship that stood alone, and the ship that will live forever in the annals of naval history.